was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die. 'Cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. I go to the movie and I go downtown. Somebody keep telling me don't hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. Then I go to my brother and I say, brother, help me please. But he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. Lord, there've been times that I thought I could last for long, but now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me begin just very much on behalf of all the family. Can welcome you all and say a big thank you. I know that some of you have travelled a long way to be with us today, but no matter how far your journey, your attendance here, it is very much appreciated, as have been all the kind thoughts, the gestures, the support. People have been wonderful, so thanks to each and every one of you. I'll just very briefly introduce myself. My name's Paul Costello. I've been asked here, well, partly as I'm a humanist celebrant. This is what I do for a living. But also, and I think more important, because I'm an old comrade. It's some 25 years ago I first met Colin. I was involved in a dispute at the time. We ended up with demonstrations outside the High Court here in Manchester. Colin came along. And of course, I've seen him on so many demonstrations and pickets and meetings in the years. The last one, just last year, down the road at Didsbury Mosque. So it is a real privilege to be asked here today. And I've been asked here because, as Colin said in his instructions, apparently I'm quite skilled at putting together non-religious ceremonies. But as much as he recognised my skills, he really wanted his great friend Gareth to MC this. So with that, I'm going to step aside. I'll be returning at the end just to officiate for the committal and stuff. But in the meantime, I'll leave you in Gareth's very capable hands. Gareth. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. Well, the music playing just now was, the music playing as we came in was Louis Armstrong. It was Colin's choice, and it relates to a kind of secret of his youth. Later on, we'll be finding out what that was. And the tone it set, I think, was deliberate. It must have been. We're coming together here in grief to remember Colin, and the part he played in all our lives, and to pay respects. But we're also celebrating a man much loved, and a life well lived, and lived with a lot of joy. That's a word Colin used so often, more freely, in fact, than anyone else I know. At his kitchen table not long ago, Colin was telling me that if he could hypothetically return and have a chance at a different career, he wouldn't choose sociologist. He'd choose, can you guess, a circus manager or ringmaster. In a theatrical circus like our chaos, of course, juggling with chainsaws and managing the spectacle, not the elephants and dancing bears kind of circus. He was an entertainer. If he was comparing, he wouldn't be reading from notes as I am. But Colin, as a sociologist, his actual career seemed to work pretty well. He was fascinated by his fellow human creatures, how they create society and how they reinvent one another. And this included an interest in human gatherings and human emotions, most of all in processes of collective empowerment, which is another of his go-to phrases. In one of his essays on emotion and ritual in the Solidarność uprising, he describes the workers' occupation of the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk. The shipyard gates became a site for strikers to gather and for emotion. It was, Colin writes, a place to laugh, to be solemn and anxious, to weep, to hope. And I guess our meeting, so to speak, today will be a little bit like those shipyard gates, with solemnity and anxiety, with weeping and some laughter, perhaps, and certainly hope, and a double shot of collective empowerment for those close to Colin. I've been getting messages from people around the world who would love to be here with us. There are many, from Titi currently in Oregon, from David in Texas, from Liz in Australia, from Andrew in London, from Neil in Scotland, and there are hundreds and hundreds of tributes that are being collected as well. But let me stop abusing the chair and hand over to Colin's family, to his youngest daughter, Nancy, then to Martin, his brother, and Peter, his nephew, who's speaking on behalf of Linda and her family. So, Nancy, if you could come up.
So in the last few weeks, I've heard so many beautiful things about Dad. I've read so many tributes about how warm he was, how generous he was of his time, and how much he influenced people with his writings and talks and correspondence. I have to admit, I kind of became a bit addicted to checking his Facebook page in the last 2 weeks to see if anybody had tagged him into anything new. It somehow helps to ease the grease a little bit, to see how well he is remembered. Because I had a kind of different relationship with him. He was simply my beloved dad. We did occasionally talk politics and ideas, but it was simply never a passion of mine, and I feel now maybe I missed out a little bit in seeing how brilliant he truly was. But he was so involved in shaping me into the person that I am today. He and Mum brought me up to believe that being a girl and then a woman should never be a reason or an excuse for doing or not doing anything. He gave me a sense of my place in the world and a real belief in equality of all kinds. Growing up, my best memories are mostly filled with the little things. Weekly grocery trips where I would perch on the end of the trolley and he'd push me around while I'd do my dying ballerina pose on the back. I think we both felt a little bit sad on the day that I decided I was just a bit too old for that. It was on those shopping trips that we also came up with the idea of a series of children's books about the adventures of Ollie the trolley that sadly never saw the light of day. Dad teaching me to cook, what he considered the basics, so a good stew, a hearty soup. I remember being a bit surprised my first year at senior school when our home economics teacher asked how much cooking we did at home, and I realised that I was the only 11-year-old in my class who actually could cook a roast dinner. We had a whole high street restaurant chain devised, though, called the House of Stews, and I'm sure many of you talked to Dad know about this. It was an antidote to the likes of McDonald's. The highest praise you could get from Dad if he tasted your food was, "You can serve this in my restaurant." You knew you'd done well if he said that to you. As an adult, whenever anything important happened in my life, I always wanted to share the news with him first. He was always there to listen, to encourage, and occasionally to poke a bit of fun and stop me getting too big for my boots. The day I got promoted at work, I shot him off this excited email and got back this immediate reply. "That's fantastic news, well done. Now learn to spell your job title correctly." I think the Dad I'll best remember, though, is the face, the one his face lit up with mischievous glee at the little things. One of my favourite stories is how he told me that he scared off some Jehovah's Witnesses who came to the door by asking, "Why don't we ever hear about Jesus the teenage years?" and then offering to sell them a copy of The Socialist Worker. The grin on his face at moments like that is how I like to remember him. I will miss you so much, Dad. Sharing crime authors and recipes, chatting about everything and nothing, and you made my world a more interesting place.
Hello everybody, Colin's family, friends, comrades. I'm his younger brother Martin. Colin was 7 years older than me, and I want to talk a little bit, not about his politics, but what he was like as an older brother. The words have gone for a moment. Give me a moment, please. I was the irritating little oik who had to share a bedroom with him. And I remember this well because I remember what it was like when, as a child, he used to come to bed later than me because he was allowed to stay up and listen to the Goon Show on the radio. And I was the irritating little bugger who, when he came to bed, and I'd stayed awake specially, said to him, "What happened?" If anybody knows the Goon Show, try it. Just try to imagine how you'd answer that. But when I began to get towards adulthood, 13, maybe 14, Colin would come home from university and he would take me to places where I had my first genuine political experiences. So he took me to the theatre and I saw the marvellous Joan Littlewood performance of Oh What a Lovely War. Learning what theatre could do. And of course, Colin very nearly took a career in theatre when he was a student. And then he took me to see the Berliner Ensemble do in German The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui. I don't speak a word of German, but I sat there absolutely gobsmacked at this parable of the rise and fall of Hitler. And to this day, I can remember from the programme the closing lines. I won't quote them to you now, but I want to tell you two particular stories about Colin because they're about the way he influenced me. I grew up in a very religious family. My mum and dad were Methodists, but religion was a kind of quiet presence in the house. It wasn't preached until one day, to their church, to my parents' horror, an evangelical preacher came. And I was hooked. I was really bowled over by this stuff. And I came home and I went on and on and on about it. And then Colin did something. And people who knew Colin will recognise the tone of voice. And he looked at me and said, "How do you know there's a God?" And he set in train a 2-year process of me thinking about it and growing up to think, and that's what he did for me. And that sentence, how do you know there's a God, came a shorter one. How do you know? And he took me on a career to become an intellectual and an academic as a result of that. Colin never really understood the kinds of research that I did. I worked on the politics of censorship and on the role of fantasy and imagination in the world. But I can tell you, we shared a bedroom. Colin had a big bookshelf at the end, and I used to go and raid it. And there were 2 books there that had a fantastic influence on me. One was simply Lady Chatterley's Lover. Good consumption material for a 14-year-old boy. The other was The Lord of the Rings. And it left an impression on me. And I bless Colin for introducing to me to something that he then was quite dismissive of later in life, because it left me thinking about the importance of imagination in the lives of people trying to make sense of the world and maybe change it. The other thing I want to remember about Colin is we went to the same school. It was a really crap school called Bancroft's. And they didn't teach us well. And Colin got into Oxford because late on in his life at school, he had one teacher who taught him how to read a poem. And Colin taught it to me in my turn as I was coming up towards my O-levels. And he taught one poem, and he showed me how to hear poetry. And it's remained hugely important to me for the rest of my life. And I'd like to read you that poem. It's by Dylan Thomas. It's not the famous one, Do Not Go Gentle, which I think would be very inappropriate. So I want to read you this poem. It's one of Dylan Thomas's ones about life and death. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age. That blasts the roots of trees is my destroyer. And I am dumb to tell the crooked rose my youth is bent by the same wintry fever. The force that drives the water through the rocks drives my red blood, that dries the mouthing streams, turns mine to wax. And I am dumb to mouth unto my veins how at the mountain spring the same mouth sucks. The hand that whirls the water in the pool stirs the quicksand, that ropes the blowing wind, hauls my shroud sail. And I am dumb to tell the hanging man how of my clade is made the hangman's line. The lips of time leach to the fountainhead. Love drips and gathers, but the fallen blood shall calm her sores. And I am dumb to tell a weather's wind how time has ticked to heaven round the stars. And I am dumb to tell the lover's tomb how at my sheet goes the same crooked worm. So long, Colin.
Good afternoon, everyone. In a life that was lived as fully as my Uncle Colin's, there are inevitably countless ways that he'll be remembered today. But what my mum, Colin's sister Linda, has asked me to convey today are some of the many family memories we have of him. Colin was an uncle to me and my elder siblings, Tom and Kate, a great uncle to Tom's son Sam and Kate's children, Charlie and Molly, a brother-in-law for 52 years to my dad, Ken, and a dearly beloved older brother to my mum for 75 years. Colin was 4 years old when Linda was born and was the last person alive to have known her all of her life. Colin, Linda and Martin had a very loving, warm childhood in Ilford with Edith and Fred, their parents who were as devoted to each other as they were to their children. When they were growing up, my mum remembers Colin taking her everywhere with him, walking to school together, to the park, exploring the local bomb sites, which, in a fairly boring London suburb in the late 40s, were used by intrepid children as unofficial playgrounds. Colin and Linda, and later when Martin arrived, were sometimes so inseparable they were literally tied together. One time, realising they would be late home for tea, clever older brother Colin decided to use string to tie all their bikes together so he could tow all of their tired legs home at full speed. Unfortunately, perhaps foreshadowing a lifelong habit of Colin's of attracting unhealthy interest from the state security services, a passing police car intervened, forced them to dismount, untie the string, and walk home instead. Another memory of my mum's was that when she was about 8, Colin took her swimming. And again, perhaps foreshadowing his lifelong wicked humour, Colin decided to throw her in the pool. Unfortunately, again, perhaps foreshadowing another of Colin's lifelong habits, overriding optimism, he underestimated the strength he required and dropped her on the concrete edge of the pool, removing most of the skin from her back. It wasn't all scrapes, though. He was a doting older brother. Colin took my mum to see her first play. Age 9, Taming of the Shrew. And he used his first ever wage packet, earned from a holiday job, sorting and packing flower bulbs, to take both Linda and Martin to the cinema to see a Disney film. Inevitably, though, all this changed when Colin turned 13, and overnight he metamorphosized into what was then a newly identified species, the teenager. Linda was transformed at the same instant, no longer a companion, but now a pest to be avoided at all costs, under strict instruction from a newly grown-up Colin not to speak to him, not to sit anywhere near him on the bus, or to demonstrate that they were in fact in any way related. An order that all of us with older siblings will recognise, Nancy. But what seems like a large age gap when your children often melts away when you become adults. And so it was with Colin and Linda, who reconnected as adults after they had both properly grown up and left Ilford. Colin's first daughter, Hannah, was born exactly a year after my parents had their first son, Tom. And within a few years, my sister Kate and cousin Nancy were also on the scene. I was a late, possibly mistaken arrival. All of the cousins are linked by our grandparents, Fred and Edith's strong belief in family, just as our parents had been. And Colin, Linda and Martin's own close family ties came into play when they came together to care for Edith and Fred towards the end of their lives. Colin, Linda and Martin, together with their respective partners, shared Edith and Fred's care and supported each other through their ultimate loss. In our household, Colin's name was mentioned dozens of times every day, thanks to my mother's inability to correctly recall the names of her own children without first reciting Colin and Martin's first. As the youngest child, I became entirely used to my full name being Martin, Tom, Kate. Oh, you know who I mean, Pete, just hurry up. My older brother Tom remembered Colin this week fondly as a warm and funny man who laughed a lot and possessed more books than he still believes it's physically possible for anyone to have read. When he was a child staying at Colin and Eva's house one Christmas, he drew a Colin's Room sign for his office door and presented it to him. Colin said he loved it, and Tom remembers the pride this gave him. And last time Tom visited the house, decades later, it was still there. And my own darling sister Kate, who can't be here today due to her own illness, but sends her love. remembers Tom and her spending a weekend in Manchester, being looked after by Colin and Eva as children. The main activity for the weekend was, what else? A socialist picnic, with Colin manning the barbecue. It was, of course, a very clever move. By associating socialism with a taste of delicious barbecued sausages, they made them converts for life. My own memories of Uncle Colin are both highly conventional and highly unconventional. Like many uncles do, Colin presented me with my first ever penknife, which I treasured for years. Highly unconventionally, there aren't many uncles who hosted 25th bedding anniversary parties, let alone one with an SWP stall there. It worked though. I joined on the spot, aged 11. I'm afraid only to say I disappointed him later as an adult by both supporting and working for New Labour. I've got pause for booze here. Feel free to... He did later joke that I was his favourite Blairite sellout. At least, I think he was joking. Colin was, in fact, an example to all of our family. I'd like to end by offering, on behalf of all my family, our deepest condolences to Eva, to Hannah, to Nancy, and to all his friends here, and by quoting directly from my mum, who wrote this to me this week. Despite our very different lifestyles, Colin's strong sense of justice and fight for a fairer world has continued to influence me all my life, and has, I think, influenced my children and grandchild in turn. For that, Colin, and for being a very special brother, uncle, and great-uncle to us all, we thank you. Thank you.
Well, we'll be hearing some music in a minute, but just before we do, I'll abuse the chair for a couple of minutes. From his early 20s onwards, Colin was a Marxist, and he was always fascinated by class struggle, the kind from below, not the other kind, and not just in workplaces, but understood throughout society. By the way, Martin, you say he ignored your work, but I'm sure he thought the racism book was brilliant, no? Anyway, we can discuss later. Sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. So he rejected the conception of class struggle as simply a bread and butter matter. And when he and I co-wrote an essay, this was the topic we chose. And so Colin came to my mind just the other day when I was reading a passage by Walter Benjamin, the German Marxist. The class struggle, Benjamin says, is a fight for the crude and material things on which all the refined and spiritual things depend. But these latter are alive in the class struggle. They take the form of confidence, courage, humour, guile, and perseverance. And these words for me capture the way that Colin himself understood class struggle and social movements. But they also bring to my mind his way of being. There's the confidence that he inspired in the people around him. It's mentioned in so many of the tributes. And of course his humour as well. There's his mischievous, that word again, his mischievous smile when he's describing the guile of militants, the workers at Roberts Arundel, for example, when they went by night to the factory gates to check if they could lift them off their pins in preparation for the next day's plans to hopefully occupy the factory. Colin also had courage. For me, that came through in his decision to leave the SWP, even though that was an easy decision in terms of his politics and ethics at that level, but it was ripping himself out of a social fabric of networks and habits into which he'd been sown over the decades. So it was a painful process that he dealt with courage and grace, and he'd be, of course, very glad to see his former comrades here today. There was a kind of courage in the way I think he faced up to death as well. His humour took a mordant turn, as you'll see in the program notes, and that was typical towards the end, I think, as well. And then finally, his perseverance to stick with his revolutionary politics, despite the arguments of his nephew and others, to stick with his belief that change is going to come. Perhaps not quite in the same way as the Sam Cooke song. I hope I'm not forcing this segue too much. But nonetheless, carried by a similar spirit, an unwavering commitment and desire.
I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die. 'Cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. I go to the movie and I go downtown. Somebody keep telling me don't hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. Then I go to my brother and I say, brother, help me please. But he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. Oh, there've been times that I thought I couldn't last for long, but now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will.
So our next speakers are Hannah and Mike. Hannah, together with Nancy and Eva, have somehow, it seemed incredible at the time, while rocked by the loss, this sort of tear in the cosmos where Colin was, they've somehow managed to organize most of today's events, down to the finest little details. And after Hannah, we'll hear from Mike. Mike is an old friend and comrade of Colin, and one who encouraged Colin to recognize the importance of his ideas, which is no mean feat. Colin was far too modest.
I'm just going to try and say some simple, nice things of how my dad reflected in me, and some very precious small moments that I have. In childhood, when we were in America, I was 7 years old, and I had a fight in a school lunch queue. The school called Dad in, and he came and talked to the teacher and said, I think, that he would discipline me, and he took me out of school. And we went down to Baskin-Robbins, 31 flavours, And I think he said something like, "It's good to stick up for myself." Back in England, we used to take the car out to Derbyshire, and the main mission was to dam a stream. And we'd follow Dad in. He was so delighted. He'd lead the way into the icy water, and we'd have this fantastic, futile, silly, joyous time just trying to stop the water with different size rocks and pebbles. In the apartment in America, actually, we had a lobby, and there was this huge bank of buttons, and somewhere was our number. And it was always a tradition that when I pressed the button, Dad would answer as Mr. Wolf. And I can't remember if we did that, and I don't know who was Mr. Wolf and who was in the lobby and who was in the apartment. And I was just going to mention to my family, and this is something if you want to ask us about, but moose turd pie. I'm going to touch on my teens. I'm going to try and touch on it lightly, because there's still some confusing, unresolved matters. There was an invisible barrier at the threshold of Dad's study. When I navigated it, when I could approach him with a work problem, always about an essay, it opened up, and he gave such real help. He asked questions and he listened, and I was able to untangle. And I learnt very much from him how to structure my thinking. And one memory also is just playing really silly word games. I've got a really clear memory of it in our old kitchen of us just giggling and being clever and playful. He also taught me this, writing notes on cards, giving presentations. Lots of people have talked about his passion for theatre. It's interesting, I was going to say something as well, this abiding love for theatre, which I've got from him. I was trying to think, what kind was it? How do I describe what was? And it was fun and clever and had a political edge and a human edge. And he talked a lot about pace, how in a theatre piece, if it had pace and it changed and had contrast, that was what was great. And Martin mentioned the Oh What a Lovely War, and we went to see another version of it when I was 18, which was just so fantastic. And we went to see Circus Oz, and we saw our chaos, and there's that scene that Dad always talked about in Circus Oz, this upside down detective scene that Dad always loved. And I just remember the delight and the laughter, and I just feel that that's quite deeply in me. As an adult, there's a moment where we went to the Wetherspoons in Chorlton together. And Dad always says that Wetherspoons was his preferred pub because you could talk, because there wasn't any music. And we just had a great time there. And we ended up planning to produce a piece of theatre together. And we talked about Castlefield, and we talked about an author that he knew. Maybe it was a Brecht adaptation, I don't know. And that didn't go anywhere. But the key thing was, it was very special, the idea and that time of just talking together and connecting. And we also did that in Paris, 5 years ago, and we wandered around the museums and we photographed classic paintings and marvelled at how wonderful it was that we could do that. And we went into little French restaurants, found little gems down alleys, and watched them cook. And we didn't have that big conversation that maybe we both thought we should do, and maybe we didn't need to. Maybe we were afraid to, I don't know. I was going to say a quick word about the music in your programme. You'll see that the Hammond song is the last song listed. And Mum and Dad found the Roaches in America together, and me and Nancy grew up listening to it, and it's from an album I think we all know all the words to. And Mum went on a surprise birthday visit when the Roaches came to Manchester on her birthday, and that ticket's on his corkboard. So I would just invite you to sit and listen to that song. The words aren't particularly relevant, but the music's just so soaring and beautiful. And then what we're going to do is also, after that, there'll be another song, which will be the leaving song. And that actually comes from a very recent discovery I made. I was rooting through drawers looking for photographs, and I came across a letter to a dear friend of his, which he perhaps posted another copy, I don't know. And he said, "If you come to my funeral ever," this is in 1983, "remember, A, no priests, B, a few jokes are more than in order, C, sing the Internationale, I always liked that one," which we will, and D, asking for a trad jazz band to play Didn't He Ramble at the end of the ceremony is probably asking too much, but the idea of everyone dancing away at the end pleases me no end. There's no pressure. But he could have the last laugh. Where's my last one? Oh dear. 8. This morning, when I was writing these cards, I looked out the window, and for the first time ever, I saw this bright orange little bird. It was a bullfinch. I looked it up. I've never seen a bullfinch before. And our garden looks over, and it's just something about that little bird and the life and the excitement and the curiosity that's somehow represented in that. That's Dad. Whenever I cook great food for a group of friends, which I love to do, there's Dad. Whenever I know clearly, even if I can't explain it, my basic political position, there's Dad. And I think there's something about just thinking deeply about things. He's there. Very recently, I've decided I'm going to drop some days at work and go back to my art some more. And he said very clearly, "Good. I haven't wanted anything more in this world more than to have more of my dad." And I think we all wanted that.
It'll become very obvious that Colin Barker was the embodiment of what Robert Burns called a man of parts, with his multiple activities and his multiple fascinations and enthusiasms. Like everybody else, I loved Colin Barker, and I rejoiced every time an opportunity came for us to talk, for us to discuss things, for his ideas to wash over me and help me to move on in my own thinking. He was warm, he was witty, he was generous, so generous indeed that he even sometimes shared the Guardian crossword with me, which is, you will know how significant that is. On the other hand, I don't think he was always happy about it, but he did share it with me. But he was deeply, deeply humane, and it seems to me, bearing in mind the Hal Draper essay that he quoted, which was so important to him and to me and to so many others. Hal Draper described socialism as a fully developed humanism, and nobody represented it that so clearly as Colin Barker. I used to look forward very much to going into the kitchen in the house, to the risotto and the soup that was invariably there and invariably good. But it struck me that the table, many of you will know it, the big wooden table in the kitchen is for much more than simply eating. It was a table around which to sit for hours and sturdy enough to bear the slamming that would come with serious debate. And so, not that I did very much slamming, but I knew it was there and it could withstand any kind of argument. And that's why it was so appropriate in Colin and Eva's kitchen. But it was obviously above all, you've heard there are words that have come up already every time anybody speaks. Mischievous, enthusiastic, and so on, are words that I'm it's not original anymore, but I want to use them. I was a victim once of his mischievous humor. Colin edited a book which I still consider to be a wonderful book, though it wasn't necessarily recognized at the time, called Revolutionary Rehearsals. I was writing a chapter on Chile, and I was, at the time, I want to say I'm now reformed, but I had a slight tendency to be late with things at the time. And Colin, knowing this about me, in his own wicked way, contacted a few comrades in Glasgow and made an arrangement with them that unless I finished my chapter on time, they would kidnap me and shave off my moustache. Now, you will see that I made it in time, but it was a very clever and very disturbing threat. Colin was a Marxist, a brilliant mind, and his ideas were infused with all the humanity that people have talked about in all the other aspects of his life. He was not a Marxist over here and a loving uncle, a loving father, a cook, a lover of poetry, a quoter of Dylan Thomas over there. These things were fused, merged in this great, brilliant and heterodox mind that was Colin Barker's. He was a Marxist for whom theory never prevails over practice. He was a Marxist for whom theory and practice merged, moved together, and moved constantly in a relationship of informing one another. He had no patience at all with formulas or cliches. He was always visionary and always, and this was critical, I think, to everything he did, responsive to a changing world. And above all, responsive to the activities of working people as they struggled against the injustices of the world they occupied, not only because he was an admirer of struggle, but because out of those struggles came new possibilities, new potentialities, visions, actions, forms of organization that perhaps were never envisaged in the theories that we worked with, but emerged out of the reality of day-to-day struggle and of working people. And that's why he was such an acute observer and such an acute listener. That book for which he's rightly remembered with great respect, the book he wrote about incomes policy and workers, arose not out of some stroke of genius in reading his way into government legislation. That would never happen with anybody, but it came because he listened to workers, spoke with them, heard what they said, and built upon their insights as well as his own. That was his great gift, and a gift which continued and developed in all the work that followed. At one point, I remember, I'm sure that the more I talked to people, the more I realized that the privilege I thought I had of his discussion about great projects with me, turns out he talked about great projects with everybody. But I don't mind. I'm quite flattered that he included me in the crowd. But the book we had discussed was called Beyond Capitalism. It was going to be a wonderful book in which we would discuss how socialism would be in every aspect. We would talk, of course, about the economy, about political society, about institutions, but we would discuss socialist sports, socialist gardening, and I imagine, certainly, socialist cookery. It would all be part of this book about the future society we envisioned, we hoped for, we yearned for, and we worked for together in the organization of which we were a part at the time, and in all the work we did, and he did with other people. Of course, the book was never published, but that's not because it's just one of the 10,000 projects that are still to be published, but because, in a sense, it could not be written. It could not be written because this new world would arise out of the reality of struggles. It would be invented as people began to resist and change and shape the world in new ways. He wrote in an essay he wrote later on to describe this moment. He said, "The moment of revolution, the moment of socialism, or the beginnings, are a moment in which," and I quote him, "the breakdown the mass struggles produced the breakdown of a political normality, commonly preserved by a mixture of fear and disbelief in the possibility of significant change." And we know how powerful that can be. But that out of those mass struggles there would emerge new kinds of relationships and institutions. This was the assurance that socialism remained a possibility and a reality and a potential in everything. And it's for that reason that he went on in his work to build the conference, which was at the center of much of his work, which interestingly enough had the double title of Alternative Futures and Social Movements. So social movements out of each of them was born. a new possibility, a new potentiality, and that potentiality, that possibility that resides within every occasion on which people turn against the system needs to be recognized, and Colin was always among the very first to recognize them and to be excited and enthused about them, because the one thing that everybody has mentioned is that excitement, that enthusiasm that informed his optimistic conviction that, as he said, even in defeats can be seen in a different way, and history shows that defeats are also new beginnings. And that optimism kept him moving on. Who would have known that a worker climbing a crane in Gdansk shipyard would be the beginning of a transformation, of a movement of transformation? Who would have imagined that half a dozen students sitting in a square in Barcelona or Madrid would start and inaugurate a movement that would spread beyond the frontiers of Spain? Who would imagine that a young anarchist shoemaker in Cochabamba, Bolivia, would go out into the square and defy the troops sent against him by the government and be the leader and be the mover of a great movement that confronted the mass corporations, the privatization of water, and for the first time in a decade drove back and beat a multinational capital and succeeded in a struggle against the government? None of these things were foreseeable. None of these things could be defined before the event. But a great Marxist, a brilliant Marxist like Colin Barker, had the critical gift of recognizing their significance, building upon them and relating to them, because I kept having in mind, I don't know why, that quote from Eliot, between the conception and the act falls the shadow. Well, what is the shadow is the failure to understand the significance of these moments. The shadow is the diversions and distractions offered by people who do not believe in socialism or are frightened by it and find other ways of diverting people's attention. The act is the moment when Marxism meets the movements and together combines to make revolution possible. And that was the future that Colin looked towards, the future that Colin believed in, and the future that he contributed so much to. But all of this is enshrined in one conception, the conception that he mentions. Many of you will know, some may not know, the essay to which he refers by Hal Draper called The Two Souls of Socialism. There, in the final phrase of that essay, is encapsulated everything that Colin understood to be the meaning of socialism. That is, the idea that socialism from below, the movement from below, is, let me find the exact formula because it's important. He says, to choose the road of socialism from below is to affirm the beginning of a new world. At each juncture, wherever there was defeat, Colin analysed, drew in an understanding and reaffirmed that socialism from below is the meaning and the significance and the hope of socialism. And now he's left us with memories, ideas, left us with an inspiration that was his person in itself, as well as the ideas and understandings he left behind. So it falls to us now to demonstrate that, as he put it in his very moving final letter, time and again, he says, the movement of popular history up to the very present time and again the ideas have surfaced and been knocked back. They will revive again and again. The wager that they can win out in practice has given meaning to my life, and it has given meaning to his life, and it has given meaning to the continuing inspiration that his friendship, that his discussions, that his understanding and his ideas can leave us with in the struggles of the future.
In Colin's instruction sheet, remember he wanted to be a circus manager. In his instruction sheet where he directs us how to run his final meeting, he suggests a reading from Trotsky's My Life. He gave us the page but not the line. I think he had the final and directly political passage in mind. He must, though, have found the lines just before it very moving, because in those, Trotsky's describing his comradeship with and his love for his wife, Natalia, or Natasha. Now, in the last 10 or 20 years, Colin gradually grew disenchanted with the traditional Trotskyist model of the micro-party. He didn't claim to have found the alternative, but he felt drawn to the softer-edged style of an organization abbreviated as RS21. That abbreviation always makes me think of WD-40. RS21 stands for Revolutionary Socialism in the 21st Century. And he helped shape that organization very much too, and so he asked that we invite RS21 members from Manchester region to be ushers here at this event, and we're asking Solvi to do the reading from my life.
Hey everyone. For 43 years of my conscious life, I have remained a revolutionist. For 42 years of them, I fought under the banner of Marxism. If I had to begin all over again, I would of course try and avoid this or that mistake, but the main course of my life would remain unchanged. I shall die a proletarian revolutionist, a Marxist, a dialectical materialist, and consequently, an irreconcilable atheist. My faith in the communist future of mankind is not less ardent, indeed it is firmer today than it was in the days of my youth. Natasha has just come up to the window from the courtyard and opened it wider so that the air may enter more freely into my room. I can see the bright green strip of grass beneath the wall and the clear blue sky above the wall and sunlight everywhere. Life is beautiful. Let the future generations cleanse it of all evil, oppression, and violence, and enjoy it to the full.
So we've heard from Mike, an very old friend of Colin, but Colin had the extraordinary gift of making new and very close friends, even at the end of his life, and we're lucky to have one of the dearest of these here with us. That's Jane McAlevey. And following Jane, well, I'll never forget the day after Colin died. Eva and Hannah and Nancy and their partners and Colin's friends, we crowded around the big kitchen table that Mike was talking about, and in the air was obviously hurt and this calamitous sense of bereftness. But then Eva said, with a kind of wry matter-of-factness, it's not a normal funeral, but more like a meeting, isn't it? And Judy, I can't see her where she is, Judy replied, and you get to sum up at the end.
It's not a normal meeting, nor is it a normal funeral, because of course Colin just wasn't normal. He was super special. So my name is Jane. Thank you so much. I feel incredibly privileged, both to have met Colin and to be here today. It's remarkable to me, actually, that I first met him. I had to look back at my notes in my computer that I only met Colin less than 5 years ago, in April of 2014. When I attended the Alternative Futures and Popular Protest Conference. And the occasion of me attending the conference, I was almost having a bad attitude about flying over to England because I had started a PhD program in sociology. And I've spent my entire life as an organizer, in struggle, in the streets, occasionally in jail, on a lot of picket lines, and for a variety of reasons, I wound up in graduate school, which was definitely not anywhere a plan of mine at age 45. I sort of needed a break. I actually just needed to take a break. I needed to take a nap, and graduate school was a way of taking a nap for me. So there I was in grad school, and my PhD advisor, who's someone esteemed in ways different and similar to Colin, Francis Fox Piven, who dragged me into graduate school, literally dragged me, like fighting and kicking, almost into a PhD. My academics around me had begun to say, you need to go to academic conferences. You need to start presenting. You have to have these things on your resume and your citations that you present at academic conferences, which I had walked into something called the American Sociological Association one day because it happened to be in New York, where I was in school, and I ran out of there as fast as I could, thinking, Jesus, certainly sociology is not going to solve the world's crisis. So I was really resentful of the idea that I had to go back to these conferences. And one day Francis said to me, I have a conference for you. In fact, I know the exact conference you want to go to. It's run by a man named Colin Barker. You will love him, and you will love the conference. And I thought to this day, how the hell did Frances know that? But she really did know. And so she was right. I, too, love Colin Barker, like so many people. And it was almost like, just intellectual love at first sight, humorous love at first sight. The guy cracks me up right into his final words he was cracking me up, right? So humor is such a big part of his life. So I first met him in 2014 at the Alternative Futures and Popular Protest Conference. And I came because it was meant to be a different conference. The funny thing about Colin and I is that I met him before I read him. I am not well-read. I did not come into the academy well-read. I can write a strike plan like nobody's business, but like a dissertation or an academic paper was quite a different thing for me. So I met Colin Barker before I read Colin Barker. And it was in meeting him and watching how he engaged people that frankly I got hooked on kind of all things Barker, including Eva, and their house, and their incredibly special warm home and kitchen table, and food, and wine, and drink, and everything else that is of the two of them. So I got hooked on Barker. And I've been in your house so many times, just since 2014, it's remarkable. And that's because I could never get enough, so I just kept finding reasons to come back. So before I left the 2014 conference, I asked Colin, what do you think I should read of yours? What writings of yours should I read? And he said to me, you should read what I wrote about individuals and social movements and about leadership in social movements, and he pointed me to Class Struggle and Social Movements. Each of them, frankly, were really powerful statements about class struggle and social change. The first one, clearly on class struggle and its importance for movements and political protest. The second, in some ways even more in depth, on a topic that he and I love to talk about, which was the role of individuals in social movements, what it takes to win, what it takes to have successful struggle. When I read them, they helped me begin to make sense of my actual life experiences with workers in struggle. They and his incredibly warm personality were, I think, why I just endlessly kept winding up knocking on Eva's door and showing up at their house and spending more time together. And part of what I think Colin did was he called on all of us to pay attention to conflicts between capitalists and workers, but not just at the workplace, but also to appreciate the different forms that class struggle takes: individual and collective, local, national, and transnational, economic and political, between movements and organizations, and within movements and organizations. Colin didn't think that class struggle happened at the workplace, or only at the workplace, or only over wages and working conditions, though it is what he and I obsessed about quite a lot. He understood that capitalists and workers engaged in struggle over many, many issues, on many fronts, including fights for the right to decent housing, free and quality health care, free child care and education, to age with dignity, to public transit, to a life free from racism and sexism. This is what he sort of thought, following on Marx, he thought of as sort of the social movement in general, as I came to understand it. Meaning at any one time, there are a variety of interconnected struggles, large and small, some better organized, some less organized. I obsess about them being better organized as often as I can, and that these kind of struggles are all underway at once in society, and that we have to look at all of these struggles to understand each of these struggles. Movements can't be understood in isolation from each other. And of course, Colin was intensely interested in revolution. He wasn't just interested in revolution out of curiosity, though as has been stated multiple times, he was intensely curious, immensely curious by his very nature. He wasn't just interested for theoretical or methodological reasons, though those concerned him. He wasn't only interested because he thought the distinction between movements and revolutions is sometimes problematic, which he did think. Colin was mainly interested in revolutions because, in fact, he was a revolutionary. Unlike mainstream academics, Colin was interested in working class revolutions in particular because he thought capitalism should be overthrown. And he thought revolution was the only viable strategy. Colin was interested, in fact, militantly committed to human liberation. Colin understood that movements are places where people learn about power, and politics, about strategy. He understood that people learned through struggle. He understood that working class people gain a sense of confidence through struggle. And gaining a sense of confidence is also something that we would talk a lot about, the role of strikes, the role of workers winning, why winning actually matters, because the class gains confidence through winning. And frankly, gaining confidence right now is going to be essential to overcome the trappings of neoliberalism, which sort of invades, in a mind-numbing way, many people's minds. So, the larger point about Colin, my closing points about Colin, which have also been made in some ways today, and how could they not be, is that Colin and his work is that he always made you think, just like his nephew talked about. He always made you think. It was amazing. And his brother, he always made you think, right? It was like you can't even imagine getting that many years of Colin. His ideas pushed all of us to clarify our own ideas about movements and revolutions, about strategy. Colin told me, after I had just gotten my PhD, that I wasn't actually a sociologist, which was sort of fine, by the way. What he said was that I was a strateologist. And strategy was an obsession of his and of mine. So I think the things I want to say about Colin is that Colin was a connector. And Colin wasn't a was to me. I talk in present tenses. I'm going to talk about Colin in the present tense, probably for the rest of my life, because when people who I love leave the planet as we understand it, it makes sense to me to talk about them in the present tense because somehow they're still here. And Colin is definitely still here. Reading him or listening to him was always like joining him in a voyage of discovery. I think of him as someone who was deeply a connector at the kitchen table, you know, over beer, over meals, over dinners. I think the first time I met him, he and Eva had organized a dinner the night before the conference that I had flown in for. And Colin will continue to live not just in the words he wrote, not just in the family that's all around him, but in the super huge connections that he's built among, frankly, not just hundreds, but thousands of activists who are actually in the struggle every day. The entire reason I'm able to come here today is because I was in Europe, because he was connecting me to people in Germany, where I was speaking and giving a big lecture at a conference on strikes in Germany this past weekend with many people who know Colin. So my deep friendships that are new will live on with Luigi, who flew here with me from Berlin, with Ian Allenson, with Lawrence, with so many new people I've met. And maybe I will close and say that part of why Colin will live on is because the worker struggle is in fact living on. Not only is the worker struggle living on, it is going to prevail, I believe. Today, in the United States of America, there are workers, 30, 4,000 strong, who walked off the job yesterday in West Virginia in a massive strike for the second time in less than a year. They were told that they won yesterday, and then someone got tipped off on a suspicion in the state of West Virginia that maybe the evil Republicans in that state were going to double back on them by midnight. And at midnight, they were still in the Capitol 10,000 strong to make sure that the bosses weren't screwing them, frankly, at the last minute. And then they decided, in a series of emails I got, that, you know what, they so didn't trust them that they're staying on strike again today to occupy the Capitol, just to make sure they don't get screwed. So I say, as long as the strike and the struggle lives, Colin lives. He lives with the strike and the struggle, and I owe so much to him and to Eva and to the family and to so many of you, and I'm just privileged to be here, and Colin will live in strike and struggle. Thank you.
Hello. So good to see so many. Colin was mine for 51 years. He was my good fortune in every sense. But our lives, even before our paths crossed, our lives ran along parallel lines. We were both in Oxford as students at the same time, although we didn't know each other. And these were days before the mass student movements got going. We grumbled in our small groups, but we didn't organize. But there was a little germ. The issue was capital punishment. A man was being hanged in the morning, and my friend Carol urged me that we should go and have a little vigil outside the Radcliffe Camera, which is one of the big buildings in the centre of Oxford. And so that's what we did. We went there and we stood. There were about a dozen of us, no more. And when we stood in silence, some workmen which were working on a building nearby asked us what we were doing, why were we there? And so we told them, and at the moment of the execution, they downed tools and they stood in silence with us. And Colin was there. Later on in life, when we told the stories, we realized we were telling the same story about the same event. He was there, and our paths were running parallel. They had not crossed yet. We met in the late 60s and became an item. And so it was that we took part in what was perhaps the most memorable march to Grosvenor Square against the Vietnam War. We learned from, I think, the German comrades, the step which went, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, and you stepped in time with this chant, and you linked arms across, and you marched forward, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh. And that broke a couple of police cordons. I tell you, it's an effective strategy. But there we were in Grosvenor Square, and in spite of the ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, I had marched peacefully, I had stood around peacefully, I had gone home peacefully. But we were in Grosvenor Square, and in front of us there was a copper standing with his back to us, with his legs planted firmly apart, grappling or doing something to some person that I couldn't see very well beyond him. And something got to me. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. I wanted to somehow help the person that I couldn't see. And so I took him by the shoulders and I brought my knee very sharply up between his well-planted legs. He whirled round and grabbed me by the face like this. And I squeaked, "Colin!" And Colin pulled me away and saved me from what would have been an arrest. And I think what he said was, "Oi, you can't do that to a woman," as he pulled me away. And in the light of the women's movement and further developments and all the things we have learned since then, I wasn't perhaps completely politically correct. But that's what he said. And I owe him my freedom from arrest all these years. And I suppose I need to say a few words of a question that has been troubling me about why he died. Why did he die? He died because he was a lifelong addict to nicotine. He only gave up smoking a few short years ago. And even then, he only gave it up for eating the stuff in tablets. So all his life, he suffered from an addiction to nicotine. Nicotine is a terrible drug. It's certainly worse than alcohol. It's worse than marijuana. It's worse than heroin even, because it is so pernicious, because it's everywhere, because it's legal, because it's everywhere advertised. And it killed him. His lungs were shot, and he had a bit of lung cancer as well as the emphysema, and the only cause of that was his lifelong addiction to nicotine. So I suppose the natural reaction to all that is to wish those who peddle the stuff dead and in hell. But after all these years, we can't really give up our opposition to capital punishment. And there is no hell. So when the Red Revolution comes, as I know it will, I hope that, well, I suppose we from past experience in history, we know that revolutions are immensely creative. They're periods when people's creativity blossoms. And I hope that those who have to deal with the tobacco barons can think of a suitable comeuppance to visit upon them. I do remember a song from my student days about we'll make Princess Margaret smoke a woodbine every day, which might be something like that, but I'll leave that to the creativity of the Red Revolution. I'm finally lost for words. He was the center of my life. He gave me direction. That table hosted so many lovely evenings with his friends around. I will miss him forever. What more can I say?
Eva was often there at the big kitchen table when I was up in Manchester very often, or very often in the last 6 months or so. I was coming up to interview Colin, and Eva would sit there with us, and you could hear her. She would chip in and share reminiscences and her peals of laughter, and sometimes mentioning her own activism around climate change, and which came to mind just now when you were talking of the nicotine. Some of the same scientists who were hired by the tobacco corporations to sow doubt about tobacco's effects on the tobacco's effects were then employed by the oil companies to disseminate doubts over climate change. I ran a series of interviews with Colin over the last 6 months or so, and I'd arranged for a final one just Friday, just gone. At this one, I was going to open up to friends and comrades on Facebook or other social media to chip in with questions for him, and it's a huge additional regret of mine that didn't come to pass. Anyway, we're next going to hear from one of those interviews from Colin himself, and then after this echo of Colin, we'll together sing the Internationale. Peter, you won't have to hold your fist, don't worry. You can sing it ironically, just this once. We're feeling generous. Hannah mentioned Colin's letter that she dug up, where he talked about us singing the Internationale and then everyone dancing away, if they wish to afterwards, after the end of proceedings. So we're hoping to sing it at slightly more up-tempo than usual, maybe with a bit more, I don't know, joie de vivre, because hopefully that reflects the song's subject, international socialism, and it certainly reflects Colin.
Before I went to university, I got involved with my friends in a love of traditional jazz. And that meant that what we lusted after more than anything was black American music. If we got hold of records by black American musicians, we were in heaven. So I wanted to be Louis Armstrong. So the question of racism just didn't arise, or it was so obvious to be against it because your heroes were these musicians who spoke in funny ways, but they were black. I was still deciding if I was a Christian in the first year at Oxford, and I went to one or two churches. That really turned out I really wasn't very interested. Anyway, a friend of mine who was training for the priesthood, a guy I'd been in school with, told me about the doctrine of grace, which is that God gives you grace and you can't choose God. And I suddenly, during my second year, I thought, that's it, it's easy. I don't need to believe in sin anymore. So I abandoned the concept of sin. I remember my second year in Oxford, around the same time, I was coming around the IS actually. I actually remember I lived in this 17th century room. I stayed in college in the second year because they didn't have enough places for everybody to live in the first year, so we thought that the people who were slightly older could live in digs and have the chance of living in the second year. So I was in this 17th century room, and I thought, I remember this, being in the middle of this room and thinking, I'm giving up on the concept of sin, I don't need it anymore. It's like there's a moment in Pilgrim's Progress when one of the characters, Christian or Pilgrim, he casts off sin. It's like he's got this fucking rucksack on his back, throws it up and he trusses his way down a hill. And giving up the concept, it was the same feeling of relief. I don't need that shit anymore. So then you went out gambling and drinking? Well, I just carried on as before, but internally, you spend a lot of time as a student sitting up late, having discussions with your friends about the existence of God, the meaning of life. I remember we read a book together. I think it might have been Miles and McIntyre, but I'm not sure, about different proofs of the existence of God, and none of them could be defended because this and he explained, carefully explained, and each night we would go through another of these. So I was trying.
Was it through McIntyre that you found the IS?
No, through the IS I found McIntyre. Right. So anyway, in my college, as it happens, I was a complete accident. There were two members of the Socialist Review. Which ones? They were called David Pearce and Bob Ashcroft. I don't know what happened to Bob Ashcroft. David Pearce went on to become the National Secretary of the IS in the 70s. And one day David Pearce, because I wore a CND badge, and obviously he evinced signs of being a suitable sort of person to talk to. He came and knocked on my door when the year I was living in college, and said, "Would you like a copy of International Socialism Journal?" And I said, "No, thank you," and shut the door. And what I used to joke about it afterwards, I can't remember exactly what I thought about at the time, but you know, a communist. You don't want to do anything to do with communists.
I've only just given up saying.
I've given up saying, and now you've got me on to attach electrodes to my genitals, or turn me into a spy for the Russians, or something. And there was an area of the library, but the main thing was it played all the interesting conversations on. And Dave Pearce and Bob Ashcroft had really interesting conversations, and I would listen to them. And they were reading a book by Ralph Miliband called Parliamentary Socialism and talking about it.
Which must have recently come out.
It had recently come out. That's right, it was the book, editor what he was talking about. And one day I said to them, first of all I said, "I think I will buy that magazine for you." And then read it from cover to cover about 4 times. Just over and over, trying to make sense of it. And it was, I think, issue number 6 of the Honest Journal, with a picture of Gaitskell on the front. And then one day I said to one of them, "Do you have meetings? And would it be okay if I came?" And they said, "Yes, we do." So at the appropriate time, they took me to the rooms of one Alistair McIntyre in Nuffield College. And the meeting, McIntyre stood in the corner, sat in the corner. We all sat on the floor, including the speaker, McIntyre. C. Wright Mills had just died. And he talked for an hour about C. Wright Mills. I'd never even heard of C. Wright Mills. I was absolutely fascinated by this whole milieu and his interesting ideas. And so after a bit longer, I joined.
Are we all right to start now, please?
Yeah, it'll take a little while for us to get assembled.
So tempo-wise, Eva. That tempo okay? Yep. In the key of A. And open voice, we're doing it with words on here. Eva, you need to be at the front. We're your choir. Do you want to say anything about it before we sing it?
I've not prepared anything. There are many versions of the Internationale. This is the one that the British movement always sings, and so this is the one that we will sing for Colin. It's not the best. The American one, I think, is better. The original was in French. I even have a version in Polish on my wall. But this is the one this is the one we sang at all the marches and the actions and the things that we did that mattered. And I think this is the one that we should sing now.
Three, 1, 2, 3.
Arise, you starlings, from your slumbers. Arise, you prisoners of want. For reason in the fathers, and the last ends the age of cant. So away with all your superstitions, so the masses arise, arise. We'll change forthwith the old traditions and spurn the dust to win the prize. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race.
Very nearly. If I could just ask everybody to return to their seats briefly, although I am going to ask you to remain standing for a little while longer, sorry. We are going to have to wrap things up quite quickly now, Eva, actually, but it's all right, we're just going to do the committal. So we're going to bring things to a close now. Well, you've already heard about the songs we'll have at the end. Well, this is really with a formal thank you and goodbye to Colin. So I'm just going to address a few words to Colin himself. He'd laugh at that. Well, what perfect timing. We finally, you've done an hour and a half without anybody's phone going off. Well, Colin, we've spent just a short time today remembering something of your life, a long and a full life. And now, on behalf of all the people whose lives you touched, you made a difference to, both here and many others are unable to be here, I'd like to just say thank you to you, Colin. Thanks for so much. Thanks for everything that made you what you were. Thanks for the humour, the mischief, the joy and the laughter. Thanks for every good turn and act of kindness. But most of all, thanks for doing what you can to make the world a better place. And yes, it's time for us to say goodbye to you, to bid you farewell. But we do so safe in the knowledge that a person, they really live for as long as the rest of us carry the memory of them inside us, and for as long as we honour that memory. So Colin, thank you